It was a bright Monday morning when 10-year-old Amara boarded the plane with her father, James Carter. Dressed in her favorite yellow sundress, with her curly hair neatly tied in 2 puffs, Amara clutched her teddy bear as they approached the first-class cabin. She loved flying. It felt like an adventure every time. James, dressed in a simple polo shirt and jeans, smiled at his daughter. He enjoyed traveling low-key, never flaunting his status, even though he was the CEO and majority owner of Skyworld Airlines, the very company whose plane they were about to board. As they stepped into the first-class section, a flight attendant named Karen approached them, her expression tightening the moment she saw Amara. "Excuse me," Karen said, blocking their way with a forced smile. "Are you sure you're in the right section? First class is for premium passengers only." James raised an eyebrow, pulling out their boarding passes, but before he could say anything, Karen's eyes zeroed in on Amara. "I'm sorry, sir, but this section isn't open for children traveling coach. You'll need to find your seats in economy." Amara's smile faded as she looked up at her dad, confused. She had flown first class many times before, but no one had ever stopped them like this. James remained calm, though his jaw tightened slightly. He handed over their first-class boarding passes to Karen, his eyes never leaving hers. "We have first-class tickets," he said quietly, his voice steady. Karen barely glanced at the tickets before shaking her head dismissively. "There must be some mistake. Perhaps you were upgraded by accident, but I'm going to have to ask you to move to the back. First class is for our premium clientele, and we have to maintain a certain standard." She emphasized the last word, her eyes flicking toward Amara with a disapproving glance. Passengers nearby started to notice the commotion. Some raised their eyebrows, whispering among themselves, while others just looked away, pretending not to hear. Amara tugged at her dad's sleeve, whispering, "Daddy, did we do something wrong?" James crouched down to her level, giving her a reassuring smile. "No, sweetheart, we didn't do anything wrong." He stood up, turning his gaze back to Karen. "I'd like to speak to the captain," James said firmly. Karen scoffed. "The captain is very busy preparing for takeoff. I'm sure he doesn't have time to deal with seat mix-ups." She crossed her arms, standing her ground. At this point, a co-pilot, noticing the growing tension, stepped out from the cockpit. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, glancing between James, Amara, and Karen. Karen quickly turned to the co-pilot, her voice dripping with confidence. "No problem at all. These passengers seem to think they belong in first class, but there's clearly been a mistake." She waved the boarding passes dismissively. "I was just guiding them back to economy." The co-pilot frowned and took the boarding passes from Karen's hand, scanning them carefully. His eyes widened slightly when he read the name, James Carter. He immediately straightened his posture and looked directly at James, his face turning pale. "Mr. Carter? I didn't realize," he stammered, realizing exactly who was standing before him. Karen blinked in confusion, her confidence wavering. "What's the issue?" she asked, still not understanding the situation. The co-pilot turned to her, his voice low but firm. "Karen, this is James Carter, the owner of Skyworld Airlines. He's your boss." For a moment, silence filled the cabin. Karen's face drained of color, her smug expression melting into shock and embarrassment. Passengers who had been watching the scene unfold gasped, some whispering among themselves, while others pulled out their phones, sensing this was a moment they wouldn't want to forget. James remained calm, his expression unreadable. Amara, still holding her teddy bear, looked up at her dad, unsure of what was happening, but feeling the shift in the air. Karen's mouth opened and closed, searching for words, but nothing came out. She finally managed a nervous laugh, trying to brush off the situation. "Oh, I didn't recognize you, Mr. Carter. My apologies. It was just a misunderstanding." She forced a smile, her tone suddenly sweet. But the damage was already done. James looked at her calmly, his eyes sharp, but his voice still steady. "It wasn't a misunderstanding," he said softly, yet his words carried weight. "You made an assumption." Karen's forced smile wavered. She opened her mouth to apologize again, but James raised his hand slightly, stopping her. "I don't need an apology from you," he continued, "but you owe one to my daughter." Karen's eyes darted to Amara, who clutched her teddy bear tighter. I'm sorry, sweetie," Karen mumbled awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable. Amara didn't respond. She simply looked up at her dad, waiting for what would happen next. James turned to the co-pilot. "I'd like to speak to the head of the cabin crew before takeoff." The co-pilot nodded quickly, disappearing down the aisle to fetch the senior flight attendant. Karen stood there, frozen, as passengers continued to stare. The whispers grew louder and the tension in the cabin was thick. Moments later, the senior flight attendant arrived, her face serious, as she quickly assessed the situation. After James quietly explained what happened, the senior attendant's expression darkened. She turned to Karen. "Karen, I need to see you in the galley. Now." Karen hesitated, her face flushed with humiliation, before finally turning and walking down the aisle, avoiding eye contact with everyone. The senior attendant turned back to James. "Mr. Carter, I deeply apologize for this incident. Please make yourself comfortable. We'll ensure you and your daughter are well taken care of." James gave a polite nod, guiding Amara to their seats. As they settled in, the buzz of whispers continued throughout the cabin. As James and Amara settled into their plush first-class seats, the atmosphere in the cabin remained charged. Passengers whispered among themselves, many of them casting curious glances toward the pair. Some even gave James subtle nods of respect, recognizing the quiet dignity with which he handled the situation. Amara leaned over to her dad, her voice soft. "Daddy, why was she so mean to us?" James sighed, brushing a curl from her forehead. "Sometimes people judge others without knowing who they really are," he explained gently. "But that says more about them than it does about us." Amara thought about that for a moment, then gave a small nod, her innocence blending with new understanding. Just as the plane began to taxi, the senior flight attendant returned, this time with 2 glasses of sparkling water and a special snack tray just for Amara. "Mr. Carter, Miss Amara," she said warmly, "we want to make sure your flight is as pleasant as possible. If you need anything at all, don't hesitate to ask." Amara's face lit up at the special attention, and she whispered to her teddy bear, "See!" We didn't do anything wrong. As the plane took off and ascended into the clouds, James glanced out the window, his mind reflecting on the events. He wasn't one to cause a scene, but he knew this incident needed to be addressed beyond just an apology. When the flight reached cruising altitude, James pulled out his phone and composed an email to the airline's HR department detailing the experience, not out of spite, but to ensure that no other family would face such unfair treatment in the future. Meanwhile, in the back of the plane, Karen sat in the galley, her face pale and her mind racing. She knew the consequences of her actions would follow her long after the plane landed. As the flight continued smoothly, Amara dozed off with her teddy bear tucked under her arm, her head resting on her dad's shoulder. James gently pulled a blanket over her and stared out the window, his mind still lingering on the incident, but focused on how to use this as a teaching moment for both Amara and his airline staff. When the plane began its descent, the senior flight attendant returned to their seats, her expression serious but respectful. "Mr. Carter," she began quietly, "I wanted to let you know that we've reported the situation to the airline's management. Karen will be addressed as soon as we land." James gave a small nod. "Thank you," he replied. "I'll be following up personally." As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, passengers began gathering their belongings. Some of them, emboldened by what they had witnessed, approached James and Amara on their way out. "That was handled with class, sir," one man said, offering a respectful nod. "You've got a strong little girl there," a woman added with a warm smile at Amara, who was now wide awake and clutching her teddy bear proudly. James thanked them politely, but his focus remained on Amara, who looked up at him with wide eyes. "Daddy, are we going to fly on your planes again?" she asked. James smiled, squeezing her hand gently. "Of course, sweetheart, but next time people like Karen will think twice before treating anyone unfairly." As they stepped off the plane, Karen stood near the exit with the rest of the crew, her posture stiff, eyes lowered, avoiding James's gaze entirely. The senior flight attendant shot Karen a warning glance as James and Amara walked past. Outside the gate, the airline's regional manager was waiting, having been alerted before the flight even landed. The moment he saw James, he rushed over, offering his sincerest apologies. "Mr. Carter, I'm deeply sorry for what happened. This isn't how we treat our passengers or anyone. Rest assured, there will be immediate action taken." James simply nodded, keeping his tone calm but firm. "I expect a full report on my desk by tomorrow morning," he said, "and make sure your staff understands we treat everyone with respect, no exceptions." With that, James took Amara's hand, and they walked through the airport together, their heads held high. The lesson had been taught, but the message was far from over. For Amara, it was a day she'd never forget. But more importantly, it was a reminder to everyone watching. Never judge a book by its cover. You never know who's really in charge. As James and Amara exited the airport, the cool breeze brushed against their faces. Amara looked up at her father, her curiosity still bubbling. "Daddy, will Karen lose her job?" she asked softly. James paused for a moment, considering his answer carefully. "That's up to the airline's policies, sweetheart," he replied. "But what's important is that she learns from this. Everyone deserves a chance to change, but they also need to face the consequences of their actions." Amara nodded thoughtfully, absorbing her father's wisdom. They climbed into their waiting car, and as they drove away, James glanced at his daughter, proud of how she handled the situation with grace and maturity beyond her years. Back at the airline headquarters the next day, the incident became a topic of discussion throughout the company. A mandatory staff meeting was scheduled, focusing on diversity, respect, and customer service. James personally oversaw the training modules to ensure no one else would face the kind of prejudice Amara had experienced. Meanwhile, the video of the incident, recorded by passengers, had started making rounds on social media. The clip showed the calm and composed way James handled the situation, contrasted sharply with Karen's dismissive attitude. The video quickly went viral, sparking conversations about unconscious bias and the importance of treating everyone with dignity, regardless of appearance. Public support poured in for James and Amara, with many praising his poise and leadership. The airline released an official statement, acknowledging the incident and outlining the steps they were taking to prevent such behavior in the future. As for Karen, after an internal review, she was given a suspension and required to undergo extensive retraining. Whether she would return to her position remained uncertain, but the lesson was clear. Assumptions have consequences. Weeks later, Amara and James boarded another Skyworld Airlines flight, greeted warmly by the crew, who now recognized them instantly. This time, there were no questions, no assumptions, just smiles and respectful greetings. Amara settled into her first-class seat with a proud grin. "Daddy," she whispered, "I think they learned their lesson." James chuckled softly, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "Yes, they did, sweetheart. Yes, they did." As the plane soared into the sky, James felt a sense of peace. The journey wasn't just about reaching their destination, It was about changing the course of how people see and treat each other. And for him, that was the most important flight of all. Months passed, and the incident became a landmark example in corporate training sessions, not just within Skyworld Airlines, but across the aviation industry. News outlets continued to reference the event as a case study in professionalism, leadership, and the dangers of making snap judgments. James, always humble, didn't bask in the attention. Instead, he used the platform to advocate for broader changes in customer service standards and diversity training across the airline industry. He was invited to speak at several conferences where he emphasized the importance of treating every customer with respect, regardless of who they were or how they looked. Amara, too, grew from the experience. At school, when her classmates heard about what had happened, they were in awe. But Amara didn't focus on the negative. Instead, she shared what her father taught her about standing up for oneself and the power of kindness in the face of prejudice. One day, while boarding another flight for a family vacation, a young flight attendant approached Amara with a warm smile. "Are you Miss Amara?" she asked gently. Amara nodded, surprised. "I just wanted to say thank you. Your story inspired me to join this airline and help make sure everyone feels welcome here." Amara beamed, feeling proud, but also realizing that even small moments could make a big difference. As they took their seats, James watched his daughter with admiration. She was growing into someone who understood the world's complexities, but faced them with courage and grace. And as the plane lifted off, soaring into the open sky, it wasn't just another flight. It was a symbol of how far they had come and how much further they could go. Years later, Amara stood in front of a large audience at her university graduation. She had been selected as the valedictorian, her speech eagerly awaited by hundreds of students, faculty, and proud families. Dressed in her cap and gown, she looked out into the crowd and spotted her father in the front row, his eyes shining with pride. As she began her speech, Amara shared the story that had shaped her perspective on life, the day a flight attendant had judged her unfairly, unaware that her father owned the airline. But Amara didn't focus on the injustice. Instead, she highlighted the lessons learned about dignity, resilience, and the importance of challenging prejudice with grace. That day taught me that we are often underestimated based on how we look or where we come from, she said, her voice steady and confident. But it also taught me that true power lies not in proving people wrong with anger, but in showing them who you are through your actions. The audience erupted in applause, many touched by her words and inspired by her strength. James felt a surge of emotion, remembering that day on the plane and how far his daughter had come since. After the ceremony, people approached Amara, praising her speech and asking for advice. She handled each interaction with the same warmth and humility her father had shown all those years ago. Later that evening, as they celebrated with family and friends, James pulled Amara aside. "You've become everything I ever hoped for, and more," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "I'm proud of how you turned a difficult moment into a lifelong lesson, for yourself and for others." Amara hugged her father tightly. "I learned from the best, Dad." As they looked out at the night sky, the stars twinkling above, James knew that the journey they had started on that plane years ago had led to something far greater than he could have ever imagined. It wasn't just about owning an airline or overcoming a single act of prejudice. It was about teaching the next generation to rise above, to lead with integrity, and to never let anyone define their worth. And in that moment, James realized something powerful. Sometimes the greatest flights we take aren't in the air, but in the hearts we inspire along the way. A few years later, Skyworld Airlines hosted its annual gala event, celebrating the company's growth and commitment to inclusivity. The event was a grand affair with industry leaders, employees, and special guests from around the world in attendance. The ballroom glittered with lights, and the atmosphere buzzed with excitement. James, now even more respected in the aviation industry, took the stage to deliver his keynote speech. But this year, he had a surprise for everyone. "Tonight," James began, "I want to introduce someone who represents the future of this airline and everything we stand for." The crowd murmured with curiosity as James turned to the side of the stage. "Please welcome my daughter, Amara Carter." Amara, now a confident young woman, stepped onto the stage, her presence commanding immediate attention. The room erupted in applause as she took the microphone. "Many of you know me as James Carter's daughter," she began, smiling warmly. "But years ago I was just a little girl denied a seat in first class, not because we didn't have the ticket, but because of how I looked." The audience fell silent, hanging on her every word. That moment could have made me bitter, but instead, it became the foundation of who I am today. My father taught me that leadership isn't about power, it's about how you treat people. And that's the kind of legacy we're building here at Skyworld Airlines. The room erupted into cheers, the message resonating deeply with everyone present. After the event, many employees approached Amara, sharing how her story had changed the culture of the airline. Karen's name was rarely mentioned anymore, but her actions had left a lasting lesson within the company. As the evening wound down, James and Amara stood on the balcony overlooking the city lights. "Dad," Amara said softly, "I've been thinking, I want to take a bigger role in the company. Not just because it's our family business, but because I believe in what we're doing." James smiled, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I was hoping you'd say that." And just like that, a new chapter began, not just for Amara and James, but for Skyworld Airlines, as it soared into a future shaped by integrity, respect, and the enduring power of standing up for what's right.